coming, and I appreciate very much your presence here. I can assure you that you won't be disappointed from the 3 lectures we are about to hear. Before introducing the 3 speakers, I would like to thank and praise the organizers of this wonderful international workshop celebrating the opening of the catalog of Synagogue wall paintings of Boris Chaimovich, Dr. Sergei Kravtsov, Dr. Vladimir Levin, and Dr. Ilya Odo. The first speaker in this session is Ms. Riva Arnold from the University of Zurich. Riva specializes in design history. She studied art history at the Arnold Institute of Art in London, received her MA from the Royal College of Art, and now studies for her PhD in the University of Zurich. Dr. Arnold will speak today on geometric surfaces in Oriental-Styled Synagogues.
Notes in his text, The Aesthetics of Architecture, that to take an aesthetic interest in a building is to attend to it in all its completeness, to see it not in terms of narrow or predetermined functions, but in terms of the visual significance it will bear. This act of aesthetics is not a rare or sophisticated thing, but whatever the degree of aesthetic attention is exercised, it will aim to embrace the significance of every part. The sense of detail is therefore an indispensable component. In the last year or two, I have been examining geometric ornaments in Oriental-styled synagogues constructed in the 19th century. Islamic ornamentation in the context of synagogues unites a global and local interest in designing spaces that borrow from the visual Islamic past, merging with Jewish practice. Wall surfaces in this paper are not just a decorative backdrop, but an intermediary between surface, craft, and ornament history. When the past is reimagined, history becomes a tool for conveying a forgotten identity, and in some cases an architectural expression. In my paper today, I will look at ornament within synagogue architecture, and to specifically address how it joins surface and geometry. Oriental-styled synagogue surfaces expand on the discussion in global ornamental and architectural studies. Islamic ornament plays a key role as it is a link between the past and present, and connects to a diverse and paradigmatic history through ornamentation, pattern, and structure. These spaces are not pointless decoration which should be ignored, but surfaces which evoke a wider exploration with important artistic lineage to understand their construction. Let's consider the surfaces as a theoretical veil or textile within Gottfried Semper's Beklagungstheory, theory, acting as a theoretical framework. Semper has a global concern for creating a higher standard of aesthetics, and as a designer and architect of the Dresden Synagogue, brings into focus the context of synagogue history, particularly in the 19th century. Semper's role is therefore invaluable in the interpretation of synagogue spaces. The concept I want to begin with is the idea that ornament is mobile. If in history entire structures, altars, and other architectural details, and objects migrated, so did its ornament. Therefore, the ornament used in these spaces is an extension of its migratory history. We also know that because of 19th century ornament books by Owen Jones and others, these sources were available, creating a widespread engagement with the East. These ornament books encapsulated centuries of artistic tradition and examples of ornament, as seen on objects in architecture, categorized into global grounds of ornament. The concluding result in application is seen in many surfaces and other examples in the 19th century. The examples found in these texts ignite the importance of geometry in the West as a source for creating ornament rooted in the abstraction of nature. The interest in creating ornament, particularly in the 19th century, had individuals taking on the role of an ornamentist, creating a space which was between architecture and design, suggesting that it is separate from the role of an artist or a sculptor. The migration of ornament unites artisans and theorists on a global and local level. It is an intermediary between connecting surfaces, geometry, and geometry brings together the sciences, craft, and evolution of thought. Before jumping into synagogue surfaces, I want to comment on a second concept I've been working with, the imagination. Imagination is an additional intermediary between architecture and the actual construction. The first intermediary is the geometric ornament, the elements of design and detail which influence the spaces of these synagogues. However, the important part is the architectural drawing itself. Architectural drawings are the state between imaginary and creating reality. Furthermore, architecture has the advantage over most arts in the creation of experience in space. An architectural drawing is a framework, but it also has a lot of freedom, which is suspended between creating a precise drawing and precision, but also connecting to an imagined experience of space. An architectural drawing is between depicting reality and consciousness with imagination. Although some might find this idea uncomfortable or ridiculous, the imagination of an architect is equally valuable component and not to be overlooked. It leads to additional avenues of interpretation of architectural spaces and helps to understand a work of art or an aspect of architecture. Acknowledging the imagination as part of the construction process, the act of drawing begins with imagination as equally associated with the intellect and geometric assembly, particularly in regard to sacred buildings and spaces, as these buildings are important repositories of cultural and aesthetic information. The many techniques of architecture and applied art decoration provided artistic shift in the 19th century, displaying new expressive quality of ornamentation. Ornamentation is also related to mathematical ideas such as linear geometry, which created a relationship between line, space, depth, and shape. Geometric patterns were created for decorative embellishment. However, two observations come into focus while examining Islamic ornament. In many cases, design is usually confined to a border function as a decorative motif. Secondly, many patterns are repetitive geometric motifs with interlaced details and can function on its own or as a background. However, the issue with Islamic ornament is that it cannot really be classified into very systematic organization as some might prefer. Furthermore, I think the variety and geometric intricacies make it hard for some to know what they're looking at or how to organize their ideas on the subject, because there are so many options and variations of pattern. These patterns do not have a detailed chronology, but scholars have been able to group certain aspects of their ornament. The groups consist of squares, circles, polygons, and star patterns. Squares are most simple and logical. At first glance are patterns that could have different effects depending on the colors used, or if the shapes are coming inward or outward. Lines can be enclosed or overlapped. Circles can also appear to be simply that they can morph into complex and intricate repeating patterns. Finally, there are polygons and star patterns. In the 10th through 16th centuries, Islamic patterns and polygons were frequently used, and these patterns in many cases have their geometric foundation in hexagons, octagons, and triangles. Polygons and star patterns were created by interlocking and dividing patterns, then dividing again into subunits. Islamic art has always been very aesthetically focused on the surface decoration. Regardless of geography, domes, mosques, objects, and monuments were covered with motifs and geometric compositions, overwhelming the surfaces. However, I think it's important to acknowledge that Islamic patterns are not exclusively one style. I think just like any ornamentation which comes from a long artistic lineage and crosses centuries, there are several elements and influences within its construction and conceptualization of design. Islamic art crosses 13 centuries, extending from Spain to Indonesia, including the decoration of Cordoba, the Alhambra, or the Taj Mahal. This is why I use the term Islamic or Oriental. By narrowing the focus of architectural significance to one aspect, for example Moorish or Neo-Moorish, in a Western taxonomy of aesthetic classification, this doesn't help. Considering the lineage of ornamental influences extends further, in order to really assess Islamic art correctly, one would have to extend its history possibly to the places which influenced it or were there before. So how do we open a new framework for geometric surfaces as a multi-level phenomenon? When we add synagogues to this discussion, it offers a contemporary approach to examining Islamic art as part of a larger global phenomenon. Most recently, Alina Payne notes that Islamic art is complex with much being left out, and it's not just about the arabesque. Islamic ornament and its influence in Western culture have been in a paradigmatic position on international debates on ornament. I would argue that these synagogues represent an intersecting of two ornament histories, encapsulating Jewish tradition and ritual and simultaneously embracing diversity by creating new cultural production, returning us to the concept of imagination, of what innovative space architecture will or could represent for its participants. Islamic ornamentation in synagogues suggests a synthesis of styles alongside architectural theory, design, and artistic geometry. One of the earliest examples of Islamic ornament within synagogue architecture was used with Semper's Dresden Synagogue. Synagogues serve as a space by crossing histories and architectural transformation. As a final thought, I'd like to briefly discuss the topics of imagination and geometry in connection with Gottfried Semper and his text Still, or translated, as style and technical or tectonic arts are practical aesthetics. His text was part of a larger global discourse on returning to the foundations of craft as an influence of architecture and the decorative arts. In terms of the theoretical framework, Gottfried Semper's reflections theory facilitates analysis of the synagogue interiors, which is part of my current research. The essence of this theory, bond or wall or dress, which share the same origin, wand and gabon, is the core of Semper's theory. Semper argues that earlier nomadic interior spaces were wrapped in carpets, which fulfilled a simple structural partition and also an aesthetic component. Semper's exploration into the impulse of building, he located the foundations of architecture in the usage of hanging woven fabrics, stating that the simple idea of hanging textiles to be the most fundamental aspect of architecture. This association is important as the textile and wall are elements of covering. Semper's theory had its foundations in textiles, as seen in tent architecture among nomadic culture and their decorated tents. Textiles and ceramics were the first area where beautification and functionality merged, which was important because his theory also links to the wider interest in creating meaningful aesthetics. Semper's theory or principle of dressing. Some might see his perspective as superficial and not necessarily a need to focus on interiors. However, for him and in my research, I see it as a space where artistic form developed and created a new spatial awareness of surface ornamentation. In his writings, he also mentions the Mishkan or tabernacle, which is one of the oldest examples of the unification of textile and structure. He notes, the oldest and most famous ceremonial tent is the tabernacle of Moses. The architectural descriptions of it have survived, are the most detailed of any building of antiquity. I assume that these descriptions found in Exodus or Flavius Josephus' Jewish antiquities are familiar to my readers, or his readers. And I would like to emphasize a point that puts us back on track with the new and very important application of the principle of dressing in the most ancient architecture, namely the veiling of structural parts of the building. The act of covering separates the inside from the outside, but in this case the application to these surfaces and the dressing of the walls acts in unifying the entire interior of the building. For Semper, there is an interplay between functionality and beauty, in which these ideas act as a kind of enclosure or fabric, where the body can occupy space. The application of Semper's theory is a new approach to examining and reinterpreting synagogue interiors. Beyond the space of Jewish social history, there is much to be explored. These synagogues display an assortment of Oriental or Islamic motifs, and by studying synagogues in this perspective, and in relation to ornament history, we can open a new discourse merging European cultural history through ornament and structure. The application of Semper's theory is important because architecture achieves its aesthetic form and the action of covering is removed from its original context and evolves into a phenomenon on its own. Thank you.
Thank you, Riva. So provoking paper, the discussion of geometric ornamentation is a difficult task. I have to admit, we've raised several questions, and I'm sure people would like to suggest, comment, suggestions, please.
Nice effort to organize a very difficult topic. The geometric possibilities within surface development, as in Islam or in Owen Jones in a Western interpretation, but to make the jump between that to the articulation of space, architectural space, or arches or whatever, the route into Islamic architecture from surface to that has been studied by other scholars, and some make the case, but it's more difficult to make that in a kind of Western context in terms of spatial volume and all. So, keep digging, and it's a jump that's very difficult to make. If you want to make the spatial jump, I would go to the mainline Victorian architectural, high Victorian Gothic, whatever, within the normal architectural channels, and then you'll see them, dealing with various ways of doing that. So,
Yeah, no, I studied 19th century architecture before I came to Synagogue.
Okay. Well, I was just saying, there's the surfaces, and then there's spatial volume.
Yeah.
And differentiating those, I think, fairly clear. But it's the volumetric spaces that will be difficult, and there'll be a zoo of people. Good luck.
Any more questions or comments?
Yeah, thanks very much for a very thorough overview. I have a question on the slide that was a picture of an interior of, I think, Morocco, this one right here. What is the source for that slide?
I honestly was looking up ways to visualize what would be the same. So this is just me looking through image libraries to try to translate what would be the same to a more visual understanding, because this drawing is from his text. So I only have this drawing to work with, but to translate this into something more visual is easier. For me, it was easier to see this image and then think of the textile, to think of ornament, to think of architecture, and the whole relationship between ornament and weaving and creating spaces through function, aesthetics, kind of channeled through this image. So it wasn't like a high scholar.
Okay.
Any more? Please.
To some extent, it seems that the adoption by Christian artists and then later Jewish artists of the Islamic motifs in the 19th century has nothing to do with Islam or Islamic art. It's a formal exercise. So there's such a gap. It seems we're dealing with something new rather than something old. But your point, using Semper's quote, linking wall covering, decorative wall covering, to the textile tradition of the tabernacle seems a very valuable entry point to reinterpreting these Moorish designs in a Jewish context that generally has not been, to my knowledge, explained before. So the Orientalizing has always been seen in social or political context, but this sort of gets to the question that was brought up yesterday. Is there a Jewish content to these decorations? And in a sense, you're suggesting that yes, there is, if we can make the tabernacle link, which would greatly expand the corpus of Jewish content wall painting in otherwise historicist synagogue. So it's an intriguing idea, so thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I think it also just expands on where other fears were looking. So the fact that Semper might have used or referenced something like the Mishkan or Tabernacle, I think, removes it from this kind of social cultural aspect and then creates it to his whole thinking on aesthetics and ancient architecture.
But the follow-up would be, did he really mean it? Because we know many contemporary architects who will give Jewish meaning post facto to a design that they adopted for another reason. So, you know, how deep was his commitment to that?
You emphasize the surface. My question is, if you take in consideration the structural solution of the synagogue with the Oriental design, like Rumbach synagogue. It's another kind. You show in German one synagogue like that, but didn't speak about it.
For which synagogue?
Dresden.
Hmm?
Which synagogue? And what's
No,
the-
in Dresden.
Sorry, I don't
You
understand.
show is this one.
Yeah.
Yes, but the interface between structure and design is very interesting, and I haven't seen it in your lecture.
Well, I mean, in terms of the archival images, he does show on other surfaces pattern and ornament. I mean, this image might not be the best one, but I mean, I'm not really sure what the key question is. I mean,
More questions, more comments? Okay.
I would like to comment to what Sam Gruber said and connect to where the tabernacle sources then turning into all Jewish thing. I'm not sure that this is the right direction. I think that this interest in Islamic pattern and decoration at that time had more to do with the wish to bring together all the religions. Like in the first half of the 19th century, especially in Germany, there was a lot of Jewish scholars entering into Islamic studies. For instance, Abraham Geiger wrote a doctorate about what Islam took from Judaism, right? So I think that this is more, it's Jewish, but Jewish as Oriental. Jewish as base for all the other religions that brings actually or diminishes the difference between them. Because we have a wonderful combination here of church-like temple in terms of space, Jewish practice, and Islamic decoration. Right? So I think that this would be like more than specifically going back to Jewish sources.
I would say maybe that would be true more for the late 19th century, but in the early decades from the 1830s through the 1860s, when the architects were Christian architects and the patronage or the urge to build often came from governmental entities as much as from Jewish communities who often had to tear down their older synagogues, combine them into one new, that it wasn't so much about the unity of religions, but about the separation, and by grouping Islam and Judaism or exotic Oriental religions to one side, they created buildings and decorative patterns that were sumptuous, but they were in opposition to traditional Christian norms. So that would be my take on it. I agree with you about Geiger and the Jewish interest in Islam, but I think it's only later when you get Gratz and others celebrating this
Right.
that
In
it comes forward.
architecture is later, but in theory it's at the same time as the governmental support.
Okay, yeah, I'll agree with you entirely on
Because
that.
Geiger was also in the 30s.
Yeah, I just want to add to, starting from what you said, Julian, There is also in Germany at that time, the early 19th century, the myth of the golden age of Jews in Spain. And the myth of the golden age was not the Christian period, it was the Islamic period. But they didn't consider, of course, there's no synagogue from the Islamic period that survived in Spain. But those of the later period, after the Reconquista, they are in Islamic style. So the architects, I think, looked at these models. Also, I don't remember the exact year, but the Transito became a national monument.
Later, this is all post-1860s as far as I know. We're talking about the introduction of the Moorish style in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. I don't know, there's a lot of disagreement on this. Many scholars have chimed in. My belief is that it was a Christian, non-Jewish instigation that Jews eventually within a generation embraced as Jewish for circumstances. But not everyone agrees with me, I think.
I think here Sam is correct, because it's not only among Jews the Spanish going, interest in the Spanish going here. It's also among non-Jews. And the whole attraction to Spain actually is connected to the whole Orientalist thing of the 19th century Europeans. And when they go to the east, to North Africa, they always pass through Spain. And Spain became like, not just for Jews, also for non-Jews, very important. The Islamic Spain.
But to my knowledge, the Christians didn't invest this Islamic ornamentation into the churches. It was only for
They did.
Only for Jews.
yeah, only the synagogues took it to sacred places. The Christians did it for non-religious buildings. To my knowledge.
There are plenty of English Gothic revival churches of the 19th century that put Islamic motifs all over the place, both architectural column motifs and decorative arts. I mean, there's a mixture, and Owens-Jones would mix them and all that, but they were part of a standard, I call it, my training, high Victorian Gothic type of ornamentation, starting in 1840s or so, but all the way to 1900. So they're Islam in a kind of bastardized intellectual way, but still they're a part of this new way of thinking about architecture.
I think there was even a belief that the Gothic had Gothic style had Islamic sources.
Only some comments. I think we are on the right way if you say it's both. It's on the one hand that's idea from the governmental architects who said the Jewish buildings should have another design than the Christian buildings, but also the Jewish communities were searching for a style that is not the Christian one. So we have both in this question, and we have, of course, and Miriam is very right to say that there was an approach to the medieval Jewish culture in the Islamic ruled countries, and at the same time it was published in many books, even many years before Gottfried Semper. They had the models for that, and they used it to specify which community is worshipping in which building. And in the Catholic area with a Protestant minority, the Protestant churches use another style than the Catholic churches, and otherwise round. In the Protestant areas you have normally Gothic churches, and then you would see Catholic churches in Romanesque style, and otherwise. And so it's a sort of historicism to distinct the styles, the communities via the styles. And there was a very early discussion about the Moorish style as being good for synagogues, because of course some Jewish architects saw that it could be place to an item to say that's a strange architecture. It's not from here. It's not part of German culture. The idea of German culture was developed at the same time. So it was a struggle for who is part of it and who not. And so we can see that the Islamic influenced synagogues were only built until before the founding of the Second Kaiserreich in 1971. So it's 1871. So you can see afterwards in Germany there were no Jewish-styled synagogues built, because that would be a sign of not being part of some German culture. And this is, I think, it's more important than the question of Semper's Bekleidungstheorie. I think it's later, and it was because it's, the first synagogues built were in this Moorish style were before Semper's synagogue, and the discussion started very early. So I think it's both, and they have, and Semper gave a reason for doing it. So it's post factum.
Professor Klein and then Professor Mischlin, and we have to finish because they are.
Well, I would like to add a footnote to the issue that churches didn't use Orientalism. It's not entirely true. Ludwig Förster, who created the most lavish Moorish-style synagogues in Budapest and Vienna, tried out his skills on the Gumpendorf Church, Lutheran Church in Vienna. So all the surface ornamentation, the lattice decoration, is taken from Islam, the capitals, you know. So it was in a general atmosphere of the period.
We have to remember that it's not only Moorish style, because we have manuscripts of the 10th century, 9th and 10th century of Islamic origin, and we have quite a lot of these things. So when Dingsburg and Stassen brought their album and decided that what is Jewish style and what is Armenian style and so on, they brought that, and we have St. Petersburg with taken from these models. So it's true that something of Spain came with more Moorish style, but also manuscripts which were done in Islamic countries, and there were Bibles, I mean, Hebrew Bibles. Yes. So they thought that if the Hebrew Bibles used these ornaments, then it must be Jewish. Funny thing is that early synagogues here in Israel don't have these.
No, I know.
Thank you, Riva.